That seat should be mine. People like me belong there.
People like you? I paid, I prepared, I earned my place.
Status decides, not sentiment.
No, justice decides, and justice starts now.
The cabin froze, every whisper swallowed by the weight of her words. For a heartbeat, even the engines seemed to hesitate, as if waiting to see which truth would prevail. Was this the moment prejudice finally lost its grip, or the moment power doubled down? The story does not end here. What comes next will shake the entire room. If you believe justice must be heard, leave one word in the comments, justice, and follow to witness the next chapter. The morning light at John F. Kennedy International Airport fell in a pale, forgiving wash over glass and steel, softening the edges of suits and roller bags and the determined tilt of travelers' shoulders. A November chill clung to coats and scarves, drifting in through the automatic doors each time they sighed open. Angela Carter arrived with the slow, steady grace of someone who understood both urgency and poise, the kind of presence that did not ask for space so much as make space by existing. She kept one hand on the handle of her carry-on and the other curled around the paper cup that smelled of cinnamon and nutmeg, a seasonal latte warm enough to steady breath. Beyond the queue of taxi drop-offs and ride-share lights, a banner wished passengers a safe holiday season, and beneath it, a tide of families and business travelers flowed in parallel lines. Security trays clattered. Announcements drifted like tides. A child pressed a mitten to the window to watch a plane roll. The airport, always a city within the city, was awake and already impatient. She moved toward Terminal 8, where voices softened beneath high ceilings, and the familiar green mermaid pulled people into line. The barista called out names and offered a quick, automatic thank you when someone tipped. A suited man behind Angela spoke into his headset and said he would land before dinner on the West Coast if the winds behaved. He laughed a small, practiced laugh meant for clients and deadlines. Another traveler, a woman in a puffer vest with a pumpkin-colored scarf, asked if boarding for first class had begun yet and whether the gate would respect status tiers. Words like first and premium and priority stitched themselves into the air. Angela did not chase them. She let them pass by and kept pace with her own breath. Her shoes made a measured sound on the polished floor, a rhythm that belonged to someone who knew that patience could be a kind of power. Near the lounge desk, conversation lowered another notch, the quiet that happens when money buys distance from noise. The flagship lounge door slid open with a dignified whisper. Inside, the light mellowed to amber and gold, and the hum of conversation bent toward the intimate. The attendant behind the counter wore a uniform that made every gesture look precise. She glanced up, returned the greeting with professional warmth, and scanned Angela's credentials. For an instant, the screen's glow held the attendant's attention longer than the gesture required. Not by much, and not enough to be called anything at all, but long enough to leave a small echo. Angela offered a gentle smile that did not press for anything more than basic courtesy. She stepped aside to let the next traveler pass and moved into a room scented with coffee, citrus, and the faint starch of pressed linen. From a leather chair near the window, she could see aircraft tails lined like bookmarks against a pale sky. A man in a navy blazer lifted his eyes from a financial paper and took her in, not rudely, exactly, but with a cataloging interest that placed her under a label before it allowed her to be a person. A younger couple at the buffet table gave a quick, sideways glance, and then found something urgent to discuss about the flatbread and the olives. The lounge, as ever, made ritual of small comforts. Fruit sections gleamed, eyes chimed against glass. A server refolded a napkin the moment a guest left to take a call. Angela settled with her latte and opened her tablet. Her calendar held the hours of the leadership summit on the West Coast, its keynotes and breakouts tidy as hotel irons. She reread the welcome note, the one that described her as a panelist on equitable philanthropy and practical kindness, and let the words sit where they needed to sit. There were, of course, other words she had carried farther and longer. They had come years ago at a kitchen table that knew the smell of dish soap and Sunday chicken, words from a woman who measured love in both advice and second helpings. If you have worked for it, you belong there. It was not a speech. It was a proverb that fit into a pocket. It worked for library cars and office doors, and today, for the double wide seats of first class. The airport did not need to agree. Her boarding pass already had. She closed the calendar and took note of small details because details often protect the spirit. A woman across from her adjusted the strap of a boot and grimaced in the polite way Americans grimace when something pinches, but they will not say so aloud. An attendant refreshed the coffee urn and left a small sign that said, "Fresh brew." Two men debated whether to try the oatmeal. One said it tasted like the memory of a better breakfast and made them both smile. The television on mute cycled through weather maps and a headline about travel delays in the Midwest, the captions running a half beat behind the images. A young service worker passed through with a cart, and someone reached for a wallet out of habit. Angela placed a folded bill into the tip jar on the counter the next time she walked by. The worker met her eyes with a thank you that had weight. Across the room, a man with a platinum-colored tag on his briefcase gestured toward the windows as if the whole runway answered to him. His voice carried the confidence of someone who had been recognized often and rarely corrected. He was not loud. He did not need to be. He said something about upgrade lists being tight this week because the flights were full and he had to keep his numbers aligned with his meetings. The person beside him murmured agreement. No one was misbehaving. It was the kind of conversation that belongs to lounges, to smooth surfaces and cars that open doors. And yet Angela felt the way one feels a draft, that the room had decided certain things about her in the moment before anyone knew her name. She did not dramatize it. She chose instead to revisit the agenda for the summit, the names of the other speakers, the biographies of community organizers whose work would always matter more than seats or titles. She underlined, in her mind, if not on the screen, a panel on accountability without spectacle, and another on how generosity becomes policy. Outside, a tug vehicle nosed a plane into the slow choreography of departure. Inside, cutlery chimed again, and someone asked for orange slices in a glass of water, and napkins folded obediently where hands requested. When at last she rose to stretch, she crossed the lounge as if no one had ever hesitated over a scanner in their life. The truth is a quiet instrument. It does not thump or demand. It tunes the room slowly. Angela traced the path past shelves of magazines and a tidy stack of the day's papers, past a display of cookies arranged in two neat rows. A television near the far wall showed an anchor mouthing concern about weather at altitude. A notice scrolled about expected arrival times. She leaned against a window ledge long enough to watch a flight crew walk the slow perimeter of a plane, their orange wands at rest. The overhead speakers, somewhere out beyond the lounge, announced a pre-boarding call for passengers requiring additional assistance. A few guests lifted their heads in reflex. Angela checked the time not with numbers but with habit. The window of boarding would open soon. She finished the last sip of her latte, a pleasant warmth that softened the edges of the morning, and returned the cup to a tray. The attendant at the desk looked up as she approached and said, with the careful cheer of hospitality, that boarding would begin shortly at the designated gate. Angela thanked her and stepped back into the stream of travelers beyond the lounge doors. The terminal's wider current caught her again. Rolling bags hummed. A toddler narrated the progress of a granola bar with the solemnity of a town crier, and the man clicked his pen in a rhythm that did not belong to music but wanted to. A couple studied a gate map and then decided to follow the smell of a diner farther down the concourse. The sign promised pancakes and eggs anyway, and coffee poured with a free hand. The glass wall to the right gave a clean line of sight to the taxiway and the last of the morning frost melting off a service truck. Somewhere, a boarding agent practiced the art of the smile that forgives chaos. Somewhere, a gate printer considered whether to finish its job without a paper jam. Angela walked as people walk in airports when they are on time but not wasteful. She kept to the edge where the rollers catch fewer heels, and when a family looked uncertain about which direction to push their mountain of luggage, she stepped aside to let them pass. A boy asked if planes slept at night, and the parents said they slept in shifts, because parents will say beautiful, unscientific things to keep wonder in the air a little longer. A trio of consultants rehearsed a deck out loud, their words smooth as glass. They spoke of outcomes and optimizations, and one of them said kindness twice and seemed not to notice that the word had changed the temperature of their conversation. She reached the gate area and observed the familiar hierarchies assemble themselves without being told. Pre-board, families with small children, active duty, elite tiers, then the wide ocean of the rest. A line of suits and wool scarves took shape near the stanchions. The agent arranged boarding lanes with quiet authority, the choreography that keeps a crowd and not a stampede. Screens above the counter displayed the flight's destination in cheerful colors. A wreath hung nearby, not yet lit, a promise of warmth for the weeks to come. The window glass held a reflection of Angela's face and, beyond it, the trail of vapor from a plane she was not on. She adjusted the strap of her bag. She did not adjust her posture. From somewhere behind, a voice that carried more confidence than courtesy observed that first class would likely be tight this morning. What with the summit out west pulling so many status holders, the remark floated in the low air of the concourse, benevolent in tone, precise in implication. Angela let it pass. The body knows which words to keep and which to let go. She faced the gate. The agent lifted the intercom. Near the windows, a child pressed palms to glass as if to push the plane forward with the force of small hope. Near the counter, a silver-haired woman tucked a boarding envelope into her purse and patted it the way one pats a promise. A kindness drifted toward Angela then, not a speech, but a look. The brief human acknowledgement between strangers who have seen the same thing and agreed, silently, that it was not nothing. It did not fix the morning. It did not have to. It simply confirmed that perception can be a form of company. Angela exhaled once, the long exhale of someone who knows that dignity is not an ornament but a practice. She rolled her shoulders back, not to appear taller but to inhabit her full height. As a boarding call echoed through the terminal, Angela knew the real test hadn't even begun. The boarding area settled into a steady hum, the kind that rises and falls with the tide of rolling bags and polite announcements. Angela joined the priority lane at gate 14, her boarding pass ready in one hand and her carry-on gliding at her heel. The agent at the podium exchanged a practiced smile with each traveler, a smile that forgave freight tempers and paper jams and promises that the flight would be on time. When Angela reached the front, Lauren Mitchell, in a neat navy uniform, took the pass, held it beneath the reader, and offered a courteous nod as the device confirmed the reservation. The confirmation light washed briefly across Lauren's face. Her eyes returned to the screen and hovered there just longer than routine. It was a pause wrapped in professionalism too brief to protest, too tangible to ignore. Angela responded with the gentlest courtesy, thanked her, and moved aside to let the next passenger through. A voice nearby, warm with self-assurance, floated across the carpet. Gregory Walsh stood a step back from the lane, a platinum tag hanging from his briefcase like a small flag. He spoke to the person at his shoulder about elite tiers and upgrade lists during busy holiday weeks. His tone was agreeable, even friendly, but it carried the ease of someone accustomed to winning small arguments without ever lifting his voice. He mentioned that the summit in Seattle had packed the forward cabin, and that status ought to count for something when seats were tight. The person beside him made a sympathetic sound. No one said anything unkind, but the words arranged themselves in a particular way, and their arrangement placed Angela on one side of an invisible line. Trevor Cole stepped in at the podium, scanning the next series of passes with even, tidy motions, the kind of rhythm that keeps a line moving and a crowd content. He glanced once toward Angela as if to check that the matter was settled and then returned to his work. She took an open place near the stanchion and lifted her eyes to the screen above the counter, which assured everyone that the flight was boarding on schedule. On the carpet near the window, a child rolled a toy car along the seam of two tiles and made a whisper of engine sounds. A woman with silver hair adjusted her scarf and said to no one in particular that the air over the Rockies could be choppy this time of year. The terminal accommodated all of it, the murmurs, the reassurances, the invisible calculations of who belongs where. When the lane opened for first class, Angela joined the short line with the ease of someone honoring instructions. Lauren greeted each passenger with a steady cadence, a good morning folded over a thank you and a welcome aboard, then repeated again. When Angela reached her, their eyes met as colleagues rather than adversaries. Lauren offered a small apology contained in a glance, Not a confession so much as a human correction. Angela accepted it with a nod and rolled forward into the jet bridge. The air cooled there, the kind of cool that clings to brushed metal and paint. She breathed once, measured, and stepped onto the aircraft. Inside the cabin, light from the windows traced clean lines across the aisle, and the seats in the first row seemed to wait with the patience of well-made furniture. A flight attendant gestured toward the overhead bin with a courteous hand, and Angela lifted her bag into place, taking care not to disturb the suitcase already there. She smoothed the handle gently back into the recess and settled into 1A, a seat by the window where the world would be framed in glass and wing. A folded menu rested on the console, promising later comforts in polite fonts. She ran a fingertip along the edge of the seatbelt as if reclaiming a small territory. Across the aisle, Gregory set his briefcase down with a discreet thud and surveyed the cabin, the way some people survey a conference room before a meeting, mapping influences, predicting outcomes. He took his seat and fastened his belt with a businesslike click. When a flight attendant passed, he lifted 2 fingers in the manner of someone used to being quickly seen. He spoke softly, too soft to reach most ears, but the cadence of the exchange carried a familiar shape: inquiry, objection, expectation. The attendant answered in calm syllables and moved toward the galley, her face composed into the professional neutrality taught in training. Angela accepted a glass of water and a warm towel and thanked the attendant with a tone that honored both gesture and labor. The water steadied the last edges of the morning. She watched a service truck make its slow arc beneath the window and thought, briefly, about the panel on equitable giving she would sit on in Seattle. Her mind circled back to the airport lounge and the kitchen table phrase that had carried her through more doors than she could count, a phrase that fit into the pocket of any day. If you have worked for it, you belong there. This was a small room with white seats and tidy lines, but the phrase belonged here, too. A pair of late passengers entered the cabin in a soft rush of apologies. Newspapers rustled. Overhead bins clicked shut like drawers in a quiet house. The intercom chimed, and a clear voice from the flight deck offered a welcome and the promise of a smooth ride west, with a note about favorable winds and a kind reminder to stow devices. Christina Hayes, the lead flight attendant, swept the aisle with the calm presence of someone who knows both procedure and people. She checked latches, offered help where help was needed, and let her smile rest lightly on each traveler, a practiced kindness never quite automatic. Gregory signaled again as Christina neared his row. His voice remained measured, but his words gathered a firmer edge. He gestured toward Angela's seat with the polite economy of a seasoned executive, pointing to a chart. He spoke of upgrades, of commitments, of an understanding he believed had been made. Christina listened, the way professionals listen, when they must honor policy and pride in the same moment. She nodded once, thanked him for the information, and said she would verify the details. Then she moved to the galley and consulted a tablet that glowed like a small confession. Angela could not hear the conversation, but she felt its reception in the shift of the room. A subtle lifting of eyes, a small hush that changes the pressure of a cabin by a fraction. Lauren approached Angela with a careful expression, one that tried to be both unobtrusive and transparent. She asked if Angela would mind showing the boarding pass once more. The request was framed in neutral language, but the world inside the request was not neutral. Angela passed it with a calm hand and folded the other hand into her lap. Lauren glanced at the tablet, compared names, compared seat assignments, and thanked Angela before retreating with a murmured apology that could not quite locate its object. The ritual ended where it had begun, but rituals of suspicion leave traces that require dignity to dissolve. Gregory settled more squarely into his seat, a posture that signaled patience while announcing claim. He leaned toward the aisle and spoke again when Christina returned. He reminded her of his tenure with the airline, of miles flown and years counted, of promises earned in the language of loyalty programs that treat memory like currency. He said it lightly, like a man reciting birthdays. But the litany placed gravity on the expectation that followed. It was the gravity of hierarchy, not of emergency. Christina's answer did not change. She used the phrases that softened refusal. I understand. I hear you. I appreciate your patience. She pointed to the manifest, to the confirmed booking, to the fact that there were no remaining seats in the forward cabin. Her voice remained level, a teacher's line on the blackboard. The information did not wobble. Gregory glanced toward Angela then, and the glance contained the question the way a sealed envelope contains a letter. It asked who she was, really, and what arithmetic in the world had placed her in 1A. The aisle narrowed under the weight of what was not being said. A man 2 rows back closed his laptop with a quiet, deliberate motion and watched the window as if the sky already held answers. A woman in a soft cardigan tucked her hands beneath her thighs, in the posture people use when they want to stay still but feel themselves rising. The air did not change temperature, but the differences between people became briefly visible, like breath on cold glass. Christina checked the time, conferred with the galley, and returned to her sweep of latches. The cabin returned to its previous volume, not because the matter had been resolved for everyone, but because routines are strong and people generally prefer them. Angela unfolded the menu to read without really reading, letting the printed words act as a small barrier against the gaze of others. She placed the menu back down with care and looked out at the wing, where the paint shone as if it had been polished by patience. Lauren reappeared with a tray of pre-departure beverages and offered them with a light touch. Angela asked for water again, and Lauren set it down with a tiny nod that carried an unspoken promise to handle what could be handled. Gregory requested something sparkling, and accepted it with the gratitude of a man collecting confirmation slips. He watched the rim of his glass for a moment, and then lifted his gaze toward Angela, as if expecting the room to align with him by force of habit. The jet bridge detached with a muted thump, and the aircraft eased backward in a slow, deliberate motion. Safety demonstrations unfolded with the choreography of a well-rehearsed play. Buckles clicked. Cars rustled out of seat pockets. Christina's voice guided eyes to exits that were nearest and possibly behind. Angela followed the motions with the respect one gives to instructions designed for strangers who owe one another care. She tightened her belt a notch and pressed her shoulders gently into the seat. The wheels rolled, then paused, then rolled again in the halting progress of a line, awaiting its turn to leap. Gregory leaned toward Christina's passing shoulder and, in a voice that had shed the last of its diplomatic polish, enunciated his verdict with the clarity of a man correcting a spreadsheet. He said, with finality that expected assent, that the seat across the aisle should have been his. It did not arrive as an argument. It arrived as a statement of order, an order that refused to admit the evidence already recorded. The sentence landed without making a sound. The cabin absorbed it the way fabric absorbs a spill wicking outward, thinning it into the weave of a larger pattern. Angela kept her gaze on the window where a sliver of runway drew a clean line under the sky. She knew the signs of ignoring noise and the art of hearing danger. The difference matters, she decided, as she had decided all morning, to honor what would move the day forward and let the rest go where unhelpful things go. The aircraft turned toward the ribbon of takeoff and waited. In that patience, the small dramas of a cabin continued their work. A wallet returned to a pocket, a ring turned on a finger, an apology rehearsed in a throat. The intercom clicked once and fell silent. Someone at the back laughed at something private and kind, the kind of laugh that leaves no debris. Angela breathed evenly, eyes on the wing, hands relaxed, but ready to lift the armrest if a neighbor needed space. She did not reach for her phone. She did not reach for a new thought. She simply sat as one sits who has learned that presence may be the quietest form of resistance. Angela sat in 1 ampere, heart pounding. As Gregory whispered to a flight attendant just a row away, the glass on the window carried a faint reflection of her face when the request arrived, not as a confrontation, but as a courtesy practiced to the softness of a plea. Christina's voice rose just above the hush of pre-departure service, the careful register of someone trained to draw heat out of a room. "Ma'am, could you step into the galley for just a moment?" Angela nodded and set the untouched glass of orange juice back onto its coaster. The cabin did what cabins do in moments like this. It listened without looking. The hum of vents held steady. The silence learned to lean. The small pause at the gate had never fully dissolved. It lingered in the air like a faint afterscent, the memory of a doorway one had been obliged to re-enter. She felt it now in the way eyes flicked and then did not, In the way the aisle felt a shade narrower than design intended. It was not danger, it was discretion, weaponized into ritual. She unfastened the belt at 1A, smoothed the crease of her skirt, and followed Christina to the front, where the curtain made privacy without granting it. Lauren stood at the edge of the galley with a tablet in her hands and a look that tried to apologize for the tool holding the look in place. Angela offered a gentle thank you that carried no sarcasm and no surrender. Christina angled her body so as to shield the conversation from the nearest ears. She spoke of a possible double assignment, the phrase tidy and familiar, offered in the tone of housekeeping. A place had perhaps been made twice for the same person. Could they take one more look at her boarding pass and her identification just to satisfy the system that wanted to be satisfied? Angela presented both, steady and unhurried. The tablet blinked its anonymous blue and white. Lauren compared letters the way a jeweler compares facets, not for beauty but for consistency. She murmured gratitude, then scrolled again, then glanced toward the manifest, the way one glances toward a rule when hoping to discover an exception in it. Christina thanked Angela for her patience, the word patience doing more work than it had agreed to do when it left the dictionary. Across the aisle behind them, the room rearranged itself around the idea of the moment. A newspaper settled. A glass made a careful landing on a tray table. Over the top of his briefcase, Gregory watched with the relaxed focus of someone who believes the world knows his preferences and is usually relieved to be reminded of them. His mouth did not smile, not exactly. It rested in an expression that implied outcomes. He spoke to no one in particular about policies that keep experiences consistent for the people who make the experiences possible. No names were named. None were required. Christina's voice softened further. She asked if Angela might accompany her just outside to the jet bridge, so they could clear this up without blocking service. The phrasing made a corridor out of an inconvenience. Angela could have asked to remain. She could have framed her own corridor. Instead, she measured the weight of the room and chose a smaller room, because sometimes dignity is carried not by refusal, but by the manner of consent. She retrieved her bag from the overhead without looking to see who measured that retrieval as proof or apology. The threshold to the jet bridge traded carpet for industrial gray and the buttery warmth of the cabin for air that smelled faintly of paint and ramps. The dull thud of distant luggage belts rolled through metal, a modest thunder on the other side of a wall. At the gate podium, Trevor appeared with a practiced frown that had learned to be polite. Another figure stood with him, broad-shouldered in a federal blue windbreaker, with plain block letters, a Transportation Security Administration agent named Mark Reynolds. He carried himself like a man who had long ago learned to separate tone from task and then found tone creeping back in under the door. Trevor began with a preface of procedure. There had been a complaint he did not say from whom, and there existed a possibility that a frequent flyer upgrade had overlapped with an already assigned seat. He asked for the boarding pass again, and Angela offered it again. As if offering proof were a normal extension of courtesy, Mark asked for identification. She provided it. He asked if she could explain the method of purchase for her ticket. The phrase rendered neutral by the absence of drama and made absurd by the context that gave it dramatic weight. The boarding area behind them continued boarding another lane. The agent at the microphone thanked families and invited the next group by name. Angela unlocked her phone and opened a folder already arranged for such conversations, not because she expected them, but because experience had taught her that preparation steals fewer hours from the soul than outrage does. She held out the confirmation email and the letter from the foundation that had arranged her travel to the summit, with the words that said in ordinary type that the cost had been covered as part of her appearance. Mark read the salient lines and then read them again, the way people read when they are not looking for meaning but for permission. He asked whether she had a printed letter as well. She did, because some habits of the analog world continue to keep people safe in the digital one. He thanked her without warmth and without cold. He said he would be just a minute, words that in airports either mean a minute or a lesson. Trevor typed briskly, the keyboard becoming a drum. Angela stood at a slight angle, not to present herself but to preserve her posture against the gaze that accrues around moments like these. The gaze came as it always comes. A man at the window pretended to look at the tug vehicles. and then permitted himself to measure her. A woman in a wool coat adjusted her purse strap and then adjusted it again. A teenage girl, quick with her phone, started to record the lens angled so that the scene could be described as general interest, until it could not. Another traveler murmured that something about this did not look right, and someone else replied that every airline had its process, and that process, like rainfall, fell on everyone eventually, the statement seeking relief in a metaphor it had not earned. Mark returned. He had the look of a person whose body remains still while the mind arranges paperwork into stacks labeled yes and no and not yet. He asked her to confirm the destination, the nature of the event, the date printed on the welcome packet. She answered in calm, complete sentences. He asked if her carry-on contained any electronics other than a phone and a tablet. She said it contained a laptop and an e-reader. He asked if he could take a brief look. She unzipped the bag with care, not as submission, but as refusal to let clumsy impatience mar a well-packed morning. He glanced, not thoroughly, just enough to fulfill the ritual. He nodded, not fully, just enough to survive his own checklist. The cabin door to the aircraft remained open, close enough to be a presence, far enough to be a condition. Through it, the climate of the room she had paid and prepared to enter again drifted like a promise laid temporarily aside. Every step of the exchange was deliberate and non-judgmental, in diction and thick with judgment in effect. The humiliation did not declare itself. It accumulated by millimeters, like dust in the crease of a book that has been opened to the same page too many times. Christina hovered at a respectful distance, her hands folded at her waist in the posture of service that cannot solve the thing it most wishes to. Lauren busied herself at the edge of scope, as if the precision of rolling a drawer shut could influence the fairness of an outcome. Trevor kept typing. Boarding groups rotated. The tannoy delivered the promise of an on-time departure in a voice that had never once been late. Angela lifted her chin a fraction, less to feel tall than to feel unbowed. She thought of her mother's proverb, the one that fit like a talisman in a pocket. If you have worked for it, you belong there. The sentence did not grow louder to meet the moment. It did not need to. Mark asked if she had any other documentation that might connect her name to the organization paying for the trip. She scrolled again and offered a letter on letterhead, a PDF that looked like a promise made visible. He studied the logo, the contact, the title line beneath her name. He spoke into his radio with a bland cadence of someone describing furniture. The reply arrived in a fuzz of syllables that made no moral claim and yet controlled the next minute of a stranger's dignity with indifferent ease. He thanked her once more and then, as if issuing a kindness, requested that she wait just a little longer. From inside the aircraft, the murmur of first class floated out like the sound of a party on the other side of a hotel wall, pleasant and slightly unreal. A passenger laughed softly at something private and brief. Eyes chimed against glass. The sound was not an insult. It was an illustration of distance. Angela let her shoulders down one notch and refused to be smaller. The young person with the phone-adjusted framing, with the unself-conscious accuracy of a generation that documents the world to prove to the world what it is doing. An older man in a tweed cap stepped closer, not to assist but to witness, and in that, witnessing something gentler than neutrality announced itself in the set of his jaw. He said softly that there had to be a better way to sort out the seat than to pull a woman aside and interrogate how her ticket had been paid. No one contradicted him. No one agreed. Airports can swallow sentences whole. Mark returned with the tone of conclusion. He said he had found no issue with the identification or the booking and that she could reboard. He did not apologize. He did not need to. Apology would have turned this from process into event, and process prefers to remain invisible no matter how visible it becomes. Trevor offered a sorry that sounded like it belonged to the idea of inconvenience rather than to the reality of insult. Christina stepped slightly forward, a subtle effort to interpose her presence between Angela and the viewing angle of the concourse. Lauren looked down, the way people do when their eyes cannot be trusted to keep a secret their conscience has already told. Angela nodded. She replaced her documents with the same care she had used in producing them. She thanked the people whose job made thank you both balm and choreography. She placed one hand on the handle of her bag and one hand on the rail where carpet meets ramp. Through the doorway, she could see the outline of 1A, the frame of a seat that waited without expectation, because furniture understands patience better than people do. Her steps did not hurry. They did not drag. The world, to its credit, made way. At the cabin threshold, the hum of pressurized air replaced the rawer draft of the jet bridge. A traveler in the second row pretended to look at a safety card and instead watched Angela's shoulders as if determining from their shape whether fairness had been done. Gregory's mouth settled into a line that expressed neither victory nor defeat, but a refusal to concede that outcomes sometimes belong to fact. The aisle was a riverbed again, and she was a stone in its center, not to obstruct, but to teach water how to travel around the truth. She took her seat. She fastened the belt with the unceremonious click of a person who still intends to move east to west and do her day's work when she gets there. The orange juice remained where it had been, 2 sips gone, the rest an emblem of interruptions. She lifted it and drank without ceremony, because sometimes the most graceful thing to do with the morning's indignity is not to give it a second chore. Christina approached with a new glass of water and set it down with a nod that contained a sentence. I saw what happened and I will carry a portion of it, so you do not have to carry all of it alone. Lauren followed with a folded napkin and a small, audible breath. The kind that sounds like a decision to do better the next time the system asks her to do worse. Angela answered them both with a look that blessed effort without exonerating cause. Control panels clicked, the chime sounded, the door remained open, a mouth waiting to finish a word. Somewhere aft, a phone screen glowed with a video already titled in the mind. A woman asked to justify her presence. Somewhere forward, a clock on a galley wall measured a minute that felt longer than the line it marked. The aircraft considered the runway as a possibility rather than a promise. The day did not apologize for being itself. Neither did she. As the boarding door loomed behind her, Angela wondered if she'd ever set foot back on that plane. Every sideways glance reminded her she was still on trial. The aircraft eased into its climb and the city unstitched beneath the wing. Neighborhoods giving way to cloud in a slow dissolve. Angela rested her head against the cushion for a breath, then sat forward again, the way people do when they refuse to let fatigue ride their posture. The aisle had returned to its orderly choreography, belts fastened, bags squared, devices in airplane mode, but the memory of the jet bridge stood at her shoulder like a quiet witness. She folded the small linen over her lap as if to anchor the morning to something tidy. The light in the cabin softened as they turned west. Overhead bins slept with their latches smiling shut. A coat sleeve drifted from one, then tucked itself back as if embarrassed by its own gravity. Christina moved through the front galley with the steadiness of someone who knows where every bottle, towel, and kindness lives. Lauren followed with trays that chimed softly when glass met glass. Angela accepted water and a lemon slice, thanked them both, and reopened her tablet to the summit agenda. Words about equitable giving and community partnerships arranged themselves into columns and bullets. She read them, not to memorize, but to keep faith with the work that made this flight more than a passage through air. Gregory watched the cabin with the restraint of a man used to seizing rooms without appearing to. He spoke in low tones to the passenger across the aisle about West Coast schedules and how certain conversations should happen face to face, not over screens. His voice wore the casual velvet of those who believe a system exists to confirm their correctness. When Christina passed, he asked for seltzer and received it with a thank you that sounded like an acceptance speech for inevitable outcomes. He did not glance at Angela directly, not often. He let his certainty look for him, the way some men let their names enter before they do. The air smoothed to a hush that felt almost domestic. The clink of ice, the rustle of a newspaper folded into obedience, the muted cough behind a fist. A man in the second row scrolled through a presentation of charts that wanted to be persuasive. A woman in the third row pressed a hand near her collarbone and breathed in slowly, counting to steady a nervousness that had nothing to do with altitude. Someone laughed softly at an audiobook and then blushed as if laughter were a breach of cabin etiquette. Angela let the smallness of these ordinary things be a balm. It is a relief, sometimes, to share a room with strangers who are busy with their own stories. She tried the crossword folded in the in-flight magazine and discovered quickly that the clues had been written by a flirt. She answered a few with modest triumph, left others to ripen, and put the magazine aside. Through the window, the wind cut a clean white V through milky Sunday. Below the glass, a river threaded away from the city like a ribbon laid down by a generous hand. She traced it with her gaze and thought about a line from a panelist she admired. Generosity that cannot survive, scrutiny is not generosity, but theater. The line touched the morning lightly and then found a place to rest. Christina returned with hot towels and a check of latches. She paused beside Angela's roll long enough for courtesy to become conversation. "Are you doing all right, ma'am?" she asked in the tone of someone hoping the question could carry more comfort than the words themselves contained. Angela said she was fine and meant it, within the boundaries the day had drawn. Christina inclined her head and moved on, her eyes writing a promise she would try to keep. The meal service began with salads that looked assembled by calm hands. Bread arrived wrapped in linen that remembered steam. Lauren asked, softly, if Angela preferred chicken or the pasta primavera. Angela chose pasta and accepted a second lemon slice with the water. She thanked Lauren by name because names matter in rooms where some people are treated as categories. Across the aisle, Gregory ordered the chicken, then asked if there were any special desserts today in a tone that assumed the day would want to be special for him. The hum of the engines braided itself with the small weather of the cabin. The temperature settled into something agreeable. The air held that aluminum hush airplanes invent, so that conversations sound private to the people having them. Angela ate a few bites, folded her napkin, and closed her eyes for the length of a measured exhale. She was not sleeping. She was guarding the edges of a day that had already asked more than it had offered. When she opened her eyes again, she reached into her bag for a pen and underlined the sentence in her notes, accountability without spectacle. The ink looked clean against the page, a promise not to sell dignity for applause. Gregory asked for a refill and received it. He adjusted his cuff as if it were a paragraph. He kept the angle of his body tilted toward the aisle, the stance of a man who expects the room to return to him at the next turn in the story. Angela did not offer him audience. She looked out the window and considered what questions she might ask the panel about turning generosity into infrastructure, how to make kindness a habit that persists after headlines move on. The sun feathered off the wing, a small cathedral of light in the thin air. A soft chime mended the quiet. Christina called the cabin's attention in that classroom voice flight attendants carry calm, clear, practiced against panic. She asked if any medical professionals were on board and, if so, would they please press the call button. The question hovered for half a breath, then the tone repeated, and a nurse in the front cabin, Rachel, called by a neighbor's whisper, pressed her button and rose with the authority of someone who has been the answer in rooms more harrowing than this one. She moved to the opposite side of the aisle, where a man in a blue sweater gripped his chest, as if the wall behind his sternum were cracking. His face had gone the color of candle wax. When the flame is a memory, everything that had been domestic became precise. Christina's voice bent toward instruction. Lauren brought the kit with hands that did not shake. The aisle, once a river for the slow drift of service, turned into a corridor that moved only one way, toward the man in the sweater. Passengers stepped back without being told, shoulders withdrawing into seats, knees creating space. The curtain to the galley opened and closed, opened and closed. The heartbeat of a small, competent world. Angela unfastened her belt, then fastened it again. She looked at Christina, who gave the slightest shake of her head, the shape of a request to remain seated unless asked. Rachel knelt and spoke to the man with a voice borrowed from quiet hallways. She asked his name, Thomas Bennett, and the words sounded like a rope she was throwing toward him. He answered as if he had to lift each letter from a heavy place. Rachel checked his pulse, listened, lifted his chin gently to clear his airway. She asked for the automated external defibrillator, and Lauren brought the case forward like a precious, awful gift. Christina called the cockpit on the interphone, then returned to help with the pads. The room leaned in without rising. A prayer traveled the length of the cabin without choosing a language. Gregory's glass sat untouched on his tray table, a bubble of seltzer trembling at its rim as if deciding whether to release itself. Angela felt the narrow, useless lift of adrenaline that comes when the body craves action and the right action is to be still. She thought of the line she had underlined, accountability without spectacle. And then she thought of something older than the line, something like a childhood memory of a neighbor who had fallen in a grocery store aisle and the way everyone had made a circle not to watch, but to guard the shock with their ordinary bodies. She breathed in and out, counted to 4, and waited. Rachel prepared the pads with a competence that rejected drama. Christina opened the case. Lauren powered the unit. The screen splashed awake, asked for patience in its digital way, and then, with a sound too small for its meaning, blinked a message no one wanted to read. Rachel leaned closer, as if proximity could teach a machine its duty. The words did not change. They glowed with the indifferent certainty of a rule that had forgotten why it existed. When Lauren tried again, the message held. Christina looked toward the galley, calculating seconds, options, probabilities that did not care how anyone felt. Around them, the cabin tried to hold its breath for a stranger. A man folded his hands and stared at his knuckles like a monk who had found himself in the wrong temple. A woman near the window pressed her lips together and whispered the name of someone she loved, as if love were the only cure her mouth could make. Gregory's face had lost its boardroom distance. He was suddenly a citizen like everyone else, reduced and enlarged by helplessness. Angela met Rachel's eyes for half a second. Rachel's gaze carried a question and a command. Be ready. Stay soft. Angela's fingers hovered over the buckle, then went still. She did not have the training to assist. She had the capacity to bear witness without making herself the subject. In the tiny kingdom of the first cabin, rank disappeared under the gravity of what a heart can and cannot do. Christina squeezed Thomas Bennett's shoulder and spoke his name again, not as information but as a rope Rachel kept throwing. The aircraft held its western heading. The clocks kept a secret none of them wanted to hear. The universe remained as indifferent as ever, and yet the aisle had become the axis on which a world of strangers turned. Christina said the words louder this time, not to alarm but to cut through the cotton of shock. Rachel nodded once without looking up. Lauren swallowed and tried the unit again, a supplication to circuitry. The display did not blink in the right rhythm. It steadied into refusal. The aisle shrank around the truth of it, and the windows suddenly seemed too far from air. Angela's skin felt pricked by the electricity of focus. She considered prayer and found instead a vow to keep the center of herself quiet. When the flight attendant shouted for the AED, the screen blinked red. Device malfunction. Rachel steadied her hands and said Thomas Bennett's name again, as if she could throw him a line across a dark river. Christina relayed details to the cockpit, her voice low and precise, and the captain answered with the calm of a person guarding a door. The interphone crackled as he tried to reach ground medical. The channel flickered in and out, a thin wire strung through weather and distance. Lauren opened the supplemental medical kit and the latch refused her. A small red light, holding fast as if policy itself had put its body in the doorway. The unit asked for an authorization path that was not in their standard sequence, and in that thin, strange pause, Christina looked up and met Angela's eyes. A choice moved between them, not dramatic, simply true. Christina stepped close enough that her words would belong to Angela and no one else. Your name is flagged with special access in our system, she said. Her voice, the softness that follows still. If I read your last name into this panel, it offers a code prompt tied to a sponsor. Would you be willing to try? If I place the device and lock the entry, the crew will shoulder the record. She asked it with the gravity of someone who knows lines can be crossed for the right reasons and must still be walked carefully. Angela's fingers had already found the folder on her tablet, where receipts and letters lived in neat digital envelopes. She scrolled to the Carter Foundation's logistics memo, the one issued when the foundation helped underwrite upgrades to aircraft kits after a season when supplies had fallen behind need. The memo had included a sponsor identifier and a contingency note. When ground contact is unstable, a flagged sponsor lead may provide a one-time unlock sequence under crew supervision with a device login time, names, and purpose for audit. She looked at Christina, measured the distance between caution and care, and nodded. Christina placed the device on the console niche and entered the prompt that called the dormant protocol awake. Angela read the letters with steady clarity, then spoke them and keyed them in, one careful symbol at a time, as if each character were a promise to an unseen witness. The unit paused, considered, and released the lock with a soft mechanical sigh that felt louder than applause. Lauren lifted the lid. Inside, order waited, vials labeled in small, frowning fonts, gloves folded like quiet hands, printed instructions that assumed daylight and peace. Rachel did not waste a single syllable. She asked for an aspirin, for a dose of nitroglycerin if indicated, for oxygen if they could stage it without tangling themselves in the aisle. Christina handed each item with a grace that made speed look elegant. The cabin had learned how to be still. Strangers had turned into furniture and then into shelter. A man pressed himself into the far edge of his seat to make room. A woman cupped her child's temple, not to shush him, but to teach him reverence without fear. The captain's voice came over the speaker in a ribbon of calm, saying they were coordinating with ground medical and that a diversion was not currently required, but that every option favored the patient. The words arrived like a warm blanket laid over cold shoulders. Rachel took them into account with a brief nod and returned to the only clock that mattered, the one in Thomas Bennett's chest. She examined him again, asked him to tell her his pain on a scale, and when words failed him, she read the answer in the tightening of his jaw. She lifted his wrist, counted silently, and looked up to find Angela steady beside her. "Talk to him," Rachel said, without looking away. "Keep him here." Angela knelt as far as the seat edge allowed, balanced on that thin strip where dignity meets need. She told him her name in an even voice that did not belong to panic and asked if he wanted her to hold his hand. He did. The briefest squeeze like a door unlatching. She described the most ordinary details she could find, because the ordinary can be a raft. She spoke of the wind beyond the window cutting the bright air like a plow through snow. She told him the air would feel cooler for a minute and then warmer again when the oxygen settled. She said Rachel's name and Christina's and Lauren's so he would know he belonged to people, and not only to pain. She asked him if there was someone he wanted to think about and let him push a single name through his teeth like a seed through soil. She said they would carry that name with him for as long as he needed. The AED unit remained sulking against its own error, an exile on the galley counter. But the supplemental kit had become a small, bright city of competence. Rachel worked with the economy of a person who has spent her life building mornings from crisis without making crisis a lifestyle. She placed a pill on Thomas's tongue with a word of instruction, measured his breaths, and listened again. The cabin's engines spoke their long, unending sentence. A prayer fluttered and landed, then climbed again. Gregory stared at the scene as if a meeting he had scheduled with the world had been replaced by the world itself, unscheduled and undeniable. A pair of hands reached forward from the row behind with a bottle of water and retreated when Christina thanked them and said everything needed was within reach. Someone farther back asked aloud if they should alert the back cabin to keep the aisle open. Christina had already done it, and she said so with a nod that respected the goodness inside the question. Another passenger offered to give up his seat if a stretcher position would be easier later. Rachel thanked him with her eyes, and the offer settled into the room like a cushion placed where it might be needed. Angela felt her own pulse inside her palm where it met Thomas's, a metronome she willed to slow. She let her voice travel at the speed of trust, neither rushing nor lagging, keeping time with the nurse's instructions and the patient's breath. She thought of the phrase she had underlined just early accountability without spectacle, and realized it had found its proof here. A crew logging every move, a sponsor code recorded in the device's unblinking memory, a patient guarded by strangers who had made themselves responsible without making a show of rescue. She felt the ache of the jet bridge moment dissolve into something useful, a clarity not of vindication but of vocation. The room had needed what she could legally and ethically offer, and she had offered it without asking permission from the world that had doubted her. The oxygen worked its quiet chemistry. The color in Thomas's face shifted, not triumphantly, but like dawn testing the edge of a shade. He stopped gripping the armrest with such exhausting purpose. Rachel measured the change with the exactness of someone who knows hope can be as tricky as an echo. She told Christina what to record. She made eye contact with Lauren long enough to hand off a list that fit into one breath. She asked Thomas to speak again, and this time his words met her at the surface more readily. As if the water had warmed, Christina took a step back and let air into the circle. She checked on the rest of the cabin with the back of the eye awareness that good leaders borrow from musicians. A man in the third row closed his eyes and lifted a silent thanksgiving that no one owned. A child whispered a question and was told yes. The helpers were winning. The aircraft continued its westward course, and the sun laid a copper ribbon along the edge of the wing. Angela felt her own shoulders drop half an inch, as if a hand had removed a weight she had not lifted alone. She told Thomas he was doing well, told him again, even though the meaning would be tested. She asked him to take another sip of air through the mask, as if he were tasting a memory. She repeated his loved one's name in the tone you say for family you have not met but hope to honor one day. She did not add anything else. Her hand remained. The quiet, too, remained. But it had changed flavor. It had come to belong to work instead of accusation. Rachel gave a small, careful smile, the kind you allow yourself only when the graph of danger bends in your favor. She spoke into Christina's shoulder, shaping the report they would hand to the captain and to ground medical. Christina nodded that she understood, and for a heartbeat her gaze returned to the device log, where Angela's name already sat beside the authorization code and the timestamp. She touched the screen once the gentlest affirmation, and then set it aside to make room for water and towels and the cooling relief of routine. Gregory had not moved. His glass had warmed in his hand. Whatever sentence he had been building with miles and status and the arithmetic of entitlement had dropped its last word somewhere between a pill and a breath. He looked at Angela not as a variable in the ledger, but as a person who had stood where a door had been and found a way to open it without breaking the frame. He looked at the crew and the nurse and the patient and did not try to inventory what portion of the scene belonged to whom. He looked as if he had been caught in the act of being human, which is to say, interrupted at last by reality. The captain came on again to say they would continue on course, that the patient was stable for now, that medical assistance would meet them on arrival. Applause did not break out. Relief did, in a softer register, like a sweater pulled over a shiver. Christina thanked the cabin for their cooperation and said service would resume when appropriate. Lauren vanished into the galley and returned with water. She did not sit down randomly, but with care, one glass at a time, as if reintroducing ordinary comforts to a room that had temporarily forgotten them. Angela eased back to her seat only when Rachel said she could. She washed her hands with a towelette and watched the thin trace of lemon evaporate into the peculiar, recycled air. She looked out the window and found the pale bone of a river and the long shadow of a cloud shaped like a sail. She allowed herself one long breath to learn what it felt like to have done the right thing in the right way without asking the day to make it mean more than what it already meant. Christina passed by and rested a hand on the seat back in silent thanks. Lauren met Angela's eyes and let a small, grateful exhale become a promise about the next moment that would ask for courage. The cabin did not return to what it had been. It became something better, as rooms sometimes do after strangers. Remember, they are not strangers. Angela lifted her water and took a drink that went down like a lesson. She placed the cup carefully on the tray and let her hand be still. For the first time all morning, Gregory had nothing to say, just a pale face staring at the woman he tried to erase. The wheels kissed the runway and held, the engine softened, and the aircraft let out the long breath of a room that has done hard work well. Angela kept her hands resting lightly on the armrests as the cabin tilted from sky to ground, listening to the soft choreography of arrival belts loosening, phones waking, bags shifting in overheads with polite thuds that sounded almost like gratitude. Christina's voice thanked the passengers for their patience and kindness, and Rachel, still near the forward galley, exchanged a small nod with Angela that said the quiet part out loud. They had carried a man back toward himself. The aisle did not rush. It formed, as it always does, by consent. When it was her turn, Angela rose, eased her bag from the bin without disturbing anyone else's morning, and waited until the line flickered forward. The door opened to the jet bridge's familiar draft, the air cooler, and a little damp with Pacific Promise. She stepped into that narrow tunnel and felt a change that had nothing to do with pressure or altitude. Faces lifted and then softened. No one cheered. No one needed to. Respect, shy and sincere, made room the way hands make room for a fragile box. A younger man who had kept the camera low earlier now kept his eyes lower still and let the device rest at his side. The silver-haired woman from the lounge pressed her palm briefly to her chest and gave Angela the kind of nod that belongs to front porches and church doorways. A ground agent said, "Welcome," with a warmth not borrowed from a script, and offered to assist the gentleman in the wheelchair first. No one objected, because kindness knows how to rank itself. The concourse gathered its own weather. Coats came out of bags for a different chill. A family reassembled itself around a stroller, with the practiced grace of people who travel together often. Over by the window, a line formed at a coffee stand where cups were handed across a counter that smelled like cinnamon and hope. The announcements here wore a West Coast inflection. Vowels eased by ocean air. Angela walked toward the gate podium as if her steps were ordinary. Because they were, and because ordinariness is sometimes a right reclaimed. Susan Miller waited there in a blazer the color of a steady sky. The badge on her lapel turned outward like a promise. She was the kind of manager whose presence makes the hallway behave. "Miss Carter," Susan said. And in the way she said, the name lived both recognition and resolve. "On behalf of the airline, I am deeply sorry for what you experienced and deeply grateful for what you did." She did not reach for Angela's hand immediately. She let her words arrive first. "I would like to speak with you briefly here or in a quieter space, whichever you prefer. We have also arranged for medical to meet the aircraft, and Mr. Bennett is being assisted as we speak." The apology was not a performance. It was a door, clear, hinged, open. "Here is fine," Angela answered, "because sunlight and witnesses can be a kind of safety." Susan did not recite policy. She named the harm and the intention to repair. She described the review that would begin before the hour had turned, the retraining that would follow where training had failed, and the accountability that would not be outsourced to formula. She did not ask Angela to retell the morning. She said the crew had documented what needed to be documented, and that her office would request a conversation later at a time of Angela's choosing. "What you should not have had to carry," she said, "quiet but exact, was yours to set down the moment you stepped onto that jet bridge." An attendant from the gate offered bottles of water with labels turned outward. Angela accepted one and tucked it into her bag. People passing nodded with a courtesy that felt like a community repairing itself in small stitches. A man in a fleece jacket with the logo of a local tech company stopped and said, "Thank you for helping," as if he were speaking to a neighbor who had jumped a battery on a cold morning. A grandmother in a quilted coat smiled and then said nothing, because sometimes not speaking is the most respectful thing available. Gregory was not at the podium. Angela saw him farther down, in conversation with two uniformed staff and a man in a suit whose smile had learned how not to smile. The exchange was calm and slow. The posture of it suggested consequence without spectacle. No one raised a voice. No one pointed. A clipboard appeared, and a pen. The matter folded itself into the file, the way paper learns to live with staples. People walked around the phrase that hung there unspoken. A line had been crossed, and lines asked to be mended after they are defended. Medical staff eased Thomas Bennett into a chair at the end of the jet bridge. His color, while not robust, looked more honest than it had at altitude. Rachel stood nearby, her hands already being washed by memory. Once you have used your hands well, they keep moving. His eyes found Angela, and he managed a thin smile that did not need to be bigger to be enough. "Thank you," he said, the words as modest as the man who carried them. Angela said he was welcome and that he had been brave, and then she stepped out of the way so the professionals could do their work. She did not linger to gather gratitude that belonged to a whole room. Near the exit of the concourse, two colleagues from the summit waited with coats on their arms and welcome on their faces. They had learned about the flight from a thread that had already begun to spool through phones and feeds, fragments of a story about a woman who had been asked to defend a seat and then had helped defend a life. One colleague's voice shook a little when she spoke. "Adrenaline makes messengers out of us. We booked a car," she said. "We thought you might not want to wait." The car smelled faintly of pine and upholstery, a civilized combination on a damp Seattle afternoon. Through the window, the sky wore that generous gray that makes neon signs look like stained glass. Downtown, traffic moved at the speed of patience. A bus pulled away from a curb with a sigh that sounded like relief. Cyclists ghosted past in bright jackets. a ribbon of motion against steel and brick. The convention center rose with the unassuming confidence of civic architecture. Inside, the carpet apologized for its pattern the way such carpets do, and the signage spoke in fonts designed to soothe. Angela's name rested on a placard outside a room with glass walls. People inside were preparing slides to tell truths more clearly than numbers sometimes like to be told. The welcome turned into a small, impromptu reception because the hour asked for one. Someone improvised a table from a pair of rolling cards and a cloth that learned it was linen when given purpose. A tray of salmon appeared. This is Seattle, after all. A server poured coffee with the generous hand of a diner waitress and accepted tips with the quiet gratitude of someone whose work remains invisible until someone insists on seeing it. Coats found the backs of chairs. Stories found the air. Susan arrived unhurried. She had not vanished into a meeting. She had followed the matter where it had gone. She repeated her apology in a different room and with different words, because apologies cannot be copied and pasted any more than dignity can. She asked if Angela needed a moment alone. Angela said no, that she would like to greet the panelists and then sit with the quiet before the work. Susan offered a card with a direct number, not a general inbox, and said any time would be the right time to call. She mentioned that the airline would be issuing a statement, and that she did not intend to wait for a news cycle to tell her what the statement should say. The reception turned into a circle without charade. People spoke not to perform empathy, but to perform care. A community organizer told a story about a grant that had made a little library into a lighthouse during a long winter. A donor admitted that the most meaningful check he had ever written had also been the smallest, because it had required him to learn the name of the person he was writing it for. Angela listened more than she talked. When she did speak, she kept to the surface where meaning could be read without squinting. She thanked the crew by name. She refused to make heroes of people for doing their jobs well. She refused to make villains of people she had not met. Reporters found a way to orbit the room without colliding with its purpose. Their questions, when they finally arrived, were soft shoes. They asked not just what happened, but what should happen next. Angela chose sentences that would travel well in other people's mouths without losing their shape. She said the morning had been bitter in exactly the way mornings can be bitter in systems that treat suspicion like a shortcut. She said the afternoon had been a lesson in what happens when skill and decency are allowed to collaborate. She said, "Don't let anyone tell you you're not worthy of your seat." And the line did not belong to triumph so much as to stewardship. It landed in the room and then, like a careful bird, landed in a dozen rooms that will hear it later. After the questions, the day asked to be ordinary again. Colleagues suggested dinner at a neighborhood diner where the menu read like a friendly letter and the pie case was honest about time. They walked there in coats, zipped to the chin, the street shining with a recent rinse of rain. The server greeted them with the tenderness that comes from serving regulars and strangers without making a distinction. She called everyone honey without offense and warmed cups before asking what they held. Angela ordered a bowl of soup that knew how to be comforting without being complicated, and a slice of pie that tasted like a memory someone had taken the trouble to write down. When the check arrived, someone reached for it and someone else reached faster. Angela tipped with deliberate generosity, because gratitude should travel farther than a table. In the quiet after dinner, news settled into its predictable pattern. A station ran a clip recorded by a passenger who had kept her hand steady. A local site posted a headline that got the facts mostly right. A thread collected testimonies that turned a story into a chorus. The airline statement arrived as promised. It named what had gone wrong and what would be done differently. It did not congratulate itself for being correct after being corrected. Susan's name was on it, and so was Christina's and Lauren's, in the paragraph that thanked the crew for their professionalism under pressure. A separate note, perhaps more important because it would reach fewer eyes, but mattered more to the ones it reached, went directly to Thomas Bennett's family with a summary of care and a list of next steps. The story stopped being a story for most people at that paragraph. For the ones still in the room, it remained a duty. Back at the hotel, the elevator gave up the small pretense of speed and let itself be slow with dignity. Angela's room held a careful symmetry of conference lodging, two lamps placed as if to ensure both thoughts and shadows behaved. She sat her back down, washed her hands a second time, because habit can be a kind of prayer, and phoned home. She did not recount every slight. She did not rehearse every kindness. She said she had landed, that the evening was cool and the soup had been good, that the panel tomorrow would be full of people worth listening to. She said the world had been the world and also better than the world, which is sometimes all a day can ask of itself. She stood by the window and looked out at a city whose lights bloom early in November. Buses grumbled, and the ferry slid like a quiet idea across dark water. She thought about the nurse's steady hands, about Christina's courage refined into procedure, about Lauren's apology breathed rather than said, about Susan's insistence on the right kind of accountability. She thought about Gregory, not as a symbol, but as a person who had found himself out of practice at being human, and she wished him a better kind of practice. She thought about Mr. Bennett speaking a single name through pain, and how a name can become a rope to hold on to when the body forgets the shore. Sleep came the way good sleep does, after a complicated day slow at first, then generous. In the morning, the convention center smelled briefly of new coffee and linens that had survived 100 meetings. People who had seen the thread the night before smiled in the hallway and then, wisely, did not ask for more than the smile offered. On stage, the lights were kinder than usual, the microphones cooperative. Angela spoke when it was time and kept silence when that was the better gift. She told the truth and let it be enough. Cameras in the back of the room captured what cameras always capture: a fraction. The rest stayed where it belonged, in the breath between sentences and the choices people would make later when no one was aiming a lens at them. The day ripened. A volunteer from a small nonprofit shook Angela's hand with both of hers and said she had almost left the field, but had decided to stay one more year. An elder from a community garden pressed a folded paper into Angela's palm with a sketch plan for a tool library and the most precise list of screws you could imagine. A city planner admitted that the phrase policy can be generous had sounded like poetry until yesterday. Now it sounded like work. Which is better? The hours passed without asking to be extraordinary. That was a relief. At the close, as people drifted toward doors and buses and dinners and small lives returning to themselves, a few cameras found Angela in the glow beyond the stage. They were not aggressive. They were persistent in the way news is persistent when it senses a story people want to believe about themselves. She answered what she could without turning a morning into a brand. The flashes were soft, owing to the room's rules, and yet she felt their prickle anyway, the way attention pricks even when it is well-intentioned. For a second, the jet bridge returned with its cooler air and its collected eyes, and then it dissolved into this different corridor with a different gaze. As cameras flashed, Angela realized this was only the beginning. Her fight for dignity had just gone public. The quiet after her long journey lingered like the hush of evening light resting on a familiar porch. What began as suspicion and humiliation had turned into an unexpected testimony of courage, kindness, and the simple power of standing one's ground with dignity. The lesson was not wrapped in spectacle, but in the recognition that compassion and fairness are the truest measures of strength. Prejudice may cast its shadow, but truth will always find its voice. And mercy has a way of stitching torn places back together. Like a lamp left burning in the window, one steady act of grace can guide us through even the darkest corridors. Take a moment to look around your own life at the kindness of neighbors, the patience of strangers, the quiet gifts that too often go unnoticed. If this story touched you, consider carrying a bit of its warmth forward to someone who may need it most.